Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to our pre-departure weeks. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes until everyone who wants to join enters the session, and then we will get started. So, just a minute or so. Okay, I see the numbers going up a little, so I'll give it a few seconds more, and then we will get started. Okay, let's get started. Um, just to quickly go over again what pre-departure weeks are before we get started with today's session. Pre-departure weeks are a series of online events and sessions where we help you feel more prepared for your arrival in Utrecht. Keep in mind that while this session on housing and some of our sessions on student life are also relevant for exchange students, not all of the sessions part of our pre-departure weeks might be relevant if you are an exchange student. So just keep that in mind. We do also send out monthly communications. If you are an exchange student and the information is not relevant to you, you can also unsubscribe to those emails. But today's session will definitely be relevant to all exchange, bachelor's, and master students. Um, so, um, today's session is, of course, on housing, where we will talk about accommodation in Utrecht. Um, just to quickly take you through the structure of today's event before we get started with the content. The event will first consist of a short presentation of 15 minutes where we take you through the main topics that you need to know about accommodation in Utrecht. While the presentation is going on, you can use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have. And our lovely chat moderators will help in answering as many of your questions as possible. Keep in mind that this session is specifically focused on housing. So if you have questions about other topics like student life or visa matters, we will have more sessions coming up later this month and next where we take you through those topics. At the end of the presentation, we will also do a live Q&A. We will first go through some of the most frequently asked questions that we get, and after that, we will also pick out some of the questions that you have asked us in the chat and answer them live. So let's get started with the presentation. In this presentation on housing, we will talk about accommodation in Utrecht. So starting off with the content of today's presentation, we will talk about the reserved accommodation program, how it works, what it's like, where it's located, and how you can apply. We will talk about private market housing, what it's like, where students live, and average costs of this. And finally, we will talk about how to start your search, what is hospiteren, agencies and private companies, SSH long stay, some tips, and how you can avoid scams. So starting off with the reserved accommodation program, it's important for you to know that housing may be arranged differently in the Netherlands than what you are used to. Dutch universities do not own any student accommodation or campus housing. Utrecht University does offer reserved housing options for new international students. This housing is reserved with various housing providers, so the contracts and booking is directly with the provider. Most international students start their search for housing by applying for this reserved accommodation program. So
So how does the reserved accommodation program work? So firstly, some important facts that you should know about the program. The offers are limited. So finding a place via this program is not guaranteed. For all accommodation options, offers usually book up extremely quickly. Secondly, the rental periods are fixed, so it's not possible to stay longer or cancel prematurely. It's also not possible to book this type of accommodation if you plan to stay in Utrecht for a shorter period than the rental period. Moving on then, what is the reserved accommodation program like? The program offers private rooms and private studios. The accommodation is set up with basic furniture. Usually this includes curtains, flooring, a single bed, mattress, desk, chair, and a wardrobe. Some of the housing providers offer additional packages that you can buy with kitchenware or with bedding. If you rent a student room, you would share facilities like the kitchen and bathroom with your housemates, which are typically also international students. The program does also offer studio accommodation. In this type of housing, you can have your own bathroom and kitchen. In this slide, you can see a selection of furnished rooms and studios by different providers part of the program. Keep in mind that additional facilities in the reserved housing are different for each residence building. Some buildings, for example, offer an outdoor area or a private balcony, a coffee corner or a study lounge, bicycle storage, or a laundry room. Each building is a popular choice for different reasons. Now that you have an idea of what it's like, let's move on to where it is located. So all the residence buildings are within easy traveling distance to the university buildings and to the city center by bike or by public transport. Because all locations have their own pros and cons, we would strongly advise you to not be too picky regarding location. Being too picky can seriously decrease your chances of successfully placing a reservation when the booking opens. Keep in mind that at this point, it may seem like there are a lot of different options, but not all residence buildings offer housing for all student groups. Some residence buildings or housing providers are specifically offering housing for either masters, bachelors, or exchange students. Then moving on to how you can apply for the reserved accommodation program. Starting with the first step, am I eligible? If you register or apply for reserved housing, you will be checked on the conditions by Utrecht University. Make sure that you also check yourself if you meet these conditions before you apply. On our website, you can find information about the conditions so you can check that you meet the eligibility criteria. If you are in doubt about your eligibility, please contact us before the booking starts so that we can help you. Okay, now that we've covered step one, am I eligible? Let's move to step two, which is to check the dates. So booking dates for the reserved accommodation program differs per student group and also based on different housing providers. You can check our website for the booking dates and times. Do not postpone your registration or booking to a later time, as this would seriously decrease your chances. So make sure that you take a look on our website to know when the booking dates are open per student group and per housing provider. Then moving on to step three, which is to apply with a housing provider. Specific application instructions differ for each housing provider. These instructions are available on our website. It's really important for you to know that you can only apply for one accommodation in total. So double bookings are not allowed, nor is placing a booking with multiple housing providers allowed. If you do make more than one booking, only one will be approved by the university, and which one that is will be random. Also take into account that a reservation fee to confirm your booking is always non-refundable. Registration prior to the start of the booking does not count as a booking itself. So this is actually possible for more than one housing provider. Registration is also free of charge. Once booking starts, this books up extremely fast. Also anticipate that you might not be able to place a reservation. Moving then to step 4, which is to make payments and sign a contract. If you do manage to place a reservation, you can follow the further instructions given to you by the housing provider.
You will receive a payment deadline, which is typically 24 hours. Consider that a reservation is cancelled automatically if you do not meet this deadline. So make sure to have your funds sorted prior to making the booking. Let's then talk about private market student housing. Like mentioned before, Dutch universities do not own student housing. Because of this, most students find housing on their own on the private market. I will now get into what this type of student housing is like, where it's located, how it's offered, and what the average costs are. So starting first with what it's like. In typical Dutch student housing, you share facilities like the bathroom and kitchen with other tenants. It can really differ how many students you live with in a specific unit. This can even go up to 15 housemates. While housing, which is part of the reserved accommodation program, is furnished, usually rooms on the private market are rented out unfurnished. This means that students arrange the flooring, curtains, and furniture themselves. Sometimes you can buy such items from the previous tenant. A number of private housing companies in Utrecht also rent out studio accommodation with basic furniture that is already provided. This type of housing is usually more expensive. On the slide, you can again see some examples of what private market student housing looks like. Then moving on to where do students live when it comes to private market student housing. And the answer to that question is really all over. The province of Utrecht, which you can see in yellow on the map, has multiple cities, towns, and municipalities, of which the city of Utrecht is just one. The entire Utrecht province is roughly the same size as the whole city of London. Because the demand for student housing in Utrecht is so high, UU students also live in other cities and surrounding smaller towns. The Netherlands is just a small country and it's really well connected with public transport. Most surrounding towns are within cycling distance to the university buildings and also have easy connection via public transport. Also good to know that the Netherlands is a really flat country. There are no hills and mountains, which makes cycling a lot easier here than in some other countries. Moving on then to the average rent of private market student housing. It's important to calculate a realistic housing budget. Although educational fees in the Netherlands might be relatively low, costs of living and housing are high. There is a huge demand for student housing. Because of this, you cannot simply decide to take the cheapest option, as there is not much choice. The cheapest options are also the ones that are typically rented out the quickest. For a lot of offers, the housing provider will also ask you to meet certain requirements of income, or they will ask you to provide a rent guarantor. Here on the slide, you can see the average monthly rent for the different types of housing, whether it's a private room, a private studio, or temporary accommodation like a hostel or a hotel. So make sure to look at these costs and calculate a realistic budget. Continuing with the topic of costs, beside the average cost for monthly rent, which you saw on the previous slide, there are also several additional mandatory monthly costs for housing that you should take into account. There are also some one-time fees and taxes. On this slide, you can see a list of all the various costs that you could expect to face. On our website, you can find more detailed information about these costs. Another thing to take into account is that due to the energy crisis in Europe, the prices of gas and electricity are still increasing. These costs are sometimes calculated in your rent, but not always. Depending on the type of housing that you rent, you may also have to arrange a gas or electricity contract yourself. Your landlord will be able to indicate this for you. Overall, we advise you to calculate a housing budget of 800 to 1,000 euros. Depending on the type of housing you end up renting, the cost may exceed this budget. Then coming to rent allowance. This is an allowance that is regulated by the Dutch government to make accommodation with private facilities more affordable to people with a lower income. We as a university cannot determine whether or not you are eligible to get this rent allowance. This can only be determined by the Dutch tax office. Besides individual requirements, the accommodation that you have also needs to meet various requirements. So not all housing is actually eligible for the rent allowance. Studio accommodation that is eligible for this scheme is extremely popular, as the monthly allowance can be quite high if you have a lower income. On the private market, these options are therefore scarcely available. You can find more information about rent allowance in the Netherlands online. Then coming to the final section of this presentation, now that you know a little about what Dutch student housing is like and the costs, I will get into the most important aspect, which is finding housing and how to actually start your search. Many students start off their search by applying for the reserved accommodation program. But since this is limited, you may have to search for housing on your own. This takes a lot of time and effort, but it's always helpful to be well prepared. Starting off with hospiteren or group viewing. One of the first Dutch words you will encounter during your search for housing is hospiteren. Hospiteren is Dutch for attending a group viewing, and it's a common way to opt for a student room in the Netherlands. This process is arranged by students themselves, and you will find that many ads are posted by the current student tenants of a house. This is how the process works. First, a room becomes available. This happens all year round. A student can move out of their room because they've graduated, for example, or because they found a new place to live. When a room becomes available, the current tenants get to search for a roommate themselves amongst their friends or by posting an ad on a social media platform or some other platform. Numerous interested students respond to the ad with a message. In the peak time of searching, typically around the start of the academic year, this can easily exceed 100 responses per ad. The current tenants then pick their top candidates for the room and invite them to a group viewing. If you are invited to a group viewing, this does not guarantee you the room, as other invited students will also be opting for the same room. During the group viewing, the candidates present themselves and try to put their best foot forward. This is called hospiteren in Dutch. After the viewing, the current tenants vote on who will become their new housemate, and that person then gets to move in. As you may understand, getting invited to a group viewing and then getting picked as the new roommate is quite competitive. It can take a lot of time, effort, and attempts before you are actually successful. Then moving on to how you can respond to an ad. When a room becomes available on a platform, numerous students respond. This can be very competitive, so it can take a lot of time and responses before you are invited to a group viewing. It helps to work on a standard message that you send out. Usually, a message includes your name, age, where you're from, interests, and hobbies. The ad also usually includes information on whether they're searching for someone who is a bit more of an independent roommate or someone who joins in on the group meals and activities. Make sure that you adapt your response to the ad to include all the information that they are actually asking for. Some tips for you is to include a fun photo of yourself. If you are planning to stay in the Netherlands for longer, for example, because you will start a bachelor's degree, make sure that you mention this. Try to include some Dutch words if you can, or mention that you are trying to learn. And don't be too picky and respond to as many ads as possible to increase your chances of being invited to a viewing. Also respond to Dutch ads. Keep in mind that the examples that you see on the screen are exactly that. They're just examples. You do not need to follow this exactly when you are responding to an ad. Then moving on to private company or agencies, most student rooms become available through the hospiteren process. However, there are also private companies that rent out their accommodation, usually private studios, through their booking portals, either with a waiting list or with a lottery system. Make sure that you don't limit yourself to just one method, as this can seriously decrease your chances. Instead, put energy in all ways to find housing simultaneously. You can find more information on our website for links to different housing agencies, companies, and platforms. Moving on then to SSH long stay housing. SSH long stay is the largest housing provider in Utrecht, and it works with a waiting list and group viewing system. SSH long stay accommodation is different from the SSH short stay. SSH short stay is furnished and is part of the reserved accommodation program, which we discussed at the start of this session. SSH long stay is unfurnished and not part of the reserved accommodation program. The waiting time to be eligible for this type of housing can be very long. As you can find on our website, the waiting list is currently over 24 months. Although it's not easy for you to get a room in this way because of the waiting list and the group viewing, we still strongly advise you to register for this type of housing if you plan to stay in the Netherlands for longer than 1 year. This will increase your chances of finding housing later on if you start building up your waiting time now. So register now if you plan to study in the Netherlands for a longer time. You can find more information on how this works on our website. Then talking about some tips to help you start your search. Because finding housing is difficult, we provide tips and information on our website to help you on your way and help you best prepare for this. Here's what you can expect and how to start. Firstly, start early. The most important thing is to not postpone your search for housing via the reserved accommodation program or on your own. A lot of students that eventually successfully find housing via the private market started their search months in advance and put in a lot of time and energy. So start now. Spread your chances and don't be too picky. Use multiple housing platforms, agencies, and social media pages, and respond to a large number of housing ads. One ad can sometimes receive numerous replies, even hundreds. So do not focus on only a small amount of offers. On our website, you can find a list of agencies and platforms. Don't limit yourself when it comes to the type of housing and location. If you only focus on one or two areas and a specific type of housing, this would seriously decrease your chances. You can find student housing across the province of Utrecht, and there are no no-go areas. Check our website for a list of towns and cities that are within easy reach to the city of Utrecht. Keep putting yourself out there. Keep putting in time and effort. Even though you won't always receive a reply and it takes months and a lot of energy, don't let this discourage you and keep responding to ads and listings. Then coming to some things to stay mindful of during your search. Searching as a group, with a friend, or as a couple. Accommodation in student housing rarely becomes available for more than one tenant, which makes searching as a group or a couple or with a friend extremely difficult. Not all types of housing is available to students. In addition, landlords usually prefer to rent a home or apartment to working couples or families with a steady income rather than students. Or landlords do not have the permit to rent to multiple tenants. Watch out for scams. Unfortunately, some people will try to take advantage of the high demand for housing by posting fake offers. We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail in the next slide. And finally, it's not uncommon to move a lot. Especially when you first arrive, it's not uncommon to move around a lot. Many students start off in a temporary accommodation, such as a hotel or hostel or a sublet, and move from one place to the next until they finally settle on something more permanent. Talking about how to avoid scams in your search for housing, it's important to remain aware of potential scams and know how to recognize them during your search. Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. So how to recognize a scammer? They ask you for large sums of money before you've actually seen the room. They say they are abroad or can't show you the room online or in person for various reasons. They give unclear answers to your questions or are overly nice. The offer seems too good to be true, like the offer is extremely sensual, sizable, or extremely affordable. Do's and don'ts. Don't transfer any money before you have seen the room and met the advertiser. Research the offer or ask us for help to research the offer. Frequently, scammers use photos of other listings, for example, which you can find out through reverse image search. When in doubt, don't take the risk. On our website, you can find more information, as scammers will keep trying to change their methods and ways to convince you that you should transfer money to them. So make sure that you read that section carefully. That brings us to the end of the presentation. For all our contact information, please visit uu.nl/housing. This is also where you can find detailed information about everything that we covered in the presentation. And if you have questions, you can contact us by WhatsApp, phone, email, or on location. Okay, that brings us to the end of the presentation. We're now going to move to answering some of your questions. As I mentioned at the start of the session, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A so that we can answer as many of your questions as possible. We're going to start first with some of the frequently asked questions that we receive. So starting first with frequently asked questions about the reserved accommodation program. On our website, you can find FAQs for each housing provider, but here are just some of the questions that are frequently asked. So firstly, are pets allowed? No, pets are not allowed in reserved accommodation. If you do wish to bring a pet to Utrecht, you would need to find housing on your own. The second question is, are there couple or family options? The reserved accommodation program only offers single person accommodation. The housing is not suitable for couples, nor for children or families. Can I book with a friend? It is really understandable that if you arrive with a friend or a peer, you would like to live together. For the reserved accommodation program, it is, however, only possible to book accommodation as an individual. As we mentioned in the presentation, searching with a group or with a friend can also be very difficult in the private market. How do I increase my booking chances? Firstly, it's important not to postpone a registration or application to a later time than the start dates which are mentioned on our website. Next, it's advised that you consider all housing options offered by the program and not to focus on just one provider or type of offer. Also, make sure that you gather all the necessary funds and documents prior to the start of the booking. Do, however, take into account that the offers are limited. Even if you are prepared and ready on the day of the booking, there is still a chance that you are not able to book. Take this into account beforehand and also research housing options on the private market. If you have more questions about the reserved accommodation program, you can put them in the Q&A and we will try to answer them. Okay, then we're going to move to some of the frequently asked questions we get about the private market student housing. So firstly, in which towns do most UU students live besides Utrecht? Because of their proximity to Utrecht, towns like Zeist, Bilthoven, De Bilt, Nieuwegein, Maarsen, and Houten are some popular locations. These are just a few. On our website, you can find a map of the entire Utrecht region and more areas where UU students settle. Secondly, how do I apply for rent allowance? First, you need to rent an accommodation that meets the requirements for rent allowance. Keep in mind that this can actually be quite tricky, as we previously explained. If you rent accommodation that is eligible, you then need to apply for allowance with the Dutch tax office. They can determine if you meet the individual requirements as well. We as a university cannot help you apply, nor can we inform you on the conditions. For this, you need to get in touch directly with the Dutch tax office. Finally, my budget is on the lower end. Does this affect my chances of finding housing? All types of housing is in high demand. However, as you can imagine, the more affordable housing options are especially popular, and therefore they're more scarcely available. If you have to exclude some types of housing due to budget reasons, be aware that this can influence your chances of finding housing. On our website, you can find a complete FAQ with more questions and answers, such as these. Then moving on, we're going to talk about some of the frequently asked questions that we get about how to start your search. So firstly, I plan to start my search later in the summer. Is this wise? The short answer to that, finding housing can take months and a lot of time and effort. So we advise you to start finding housing now. Can I attend group viewings while still abroad? You could suggest to attend a viewing through live video, but usually it does help to be in the Netherlands. If possible, it can help to arrive early in the summer, June, July, August, and arrange to attend viewings in person. Overall, try to arrange as many viewings as possible ahead of time before you arrive. So when you arrive, you have a number of viewings that you can attend. What if I have not found housing prior to departure? Many students experience severe difficulties in finding housing upon arrival, especially in the first months of the start of the academic year, which is the peak of student arrivals. We hear from our students that they find it very challenging to study and search for housing at the same time, as this does take a lot of energy to keep up with. You also have to take into account that arranging a temporary place like a hostel or a hotel for the first period of stay, like the first few months, and moving around a lot is generally very costly. Not having found housing prior to your departure can therefore lead to a difficult and disappointing experience once you're here. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide if you wish to take the risk and accept the consequences. Do, however, seriously consider the situation this would put you in and prepare ahead of time. We have a lot more frequently asked questions answered on our website, so definitely take a look at this as well, as this can help you while you're on your search for housing. Now, let's get into some of the questions that you have asked us in the chat. We have a few minutes left for that. Okay, I'm just going to see what's in the chat. Um, okay, I see a question about location of housing. So a student asked, what would be the closest residential area to the university in Utrecht? The answer to that question is that all the university buildings, all the buildings are located close to the various university buildings. Students do typically find it quite easy to take a bike or public transport, so don't be too picky on the location. As we mentioned in the presentation as well, the Netherlands is a really small country and it is really well connected by bike or by public transport. Areas are typically not too far away to go to get to the university buildings. Okay. Um, then I see another question about the reserved accommodation program. Can I book a room through the reserved accommodation program if I have not exchanged my conditional offer to an unconditional offer? The answer to that question is that conditions for application differ per student group. For the conditions, you can take a look at our website, uu.nl/housing, and select your student group for more information on the reserved accommodation program. If you do not find the answer to your question there, you can then send an email to us to studentservices@uu.nl. Okay, continuing then to the next question, which is also about location. So, are there any bad neighborhoods that we should avoid? There are no no-go areas in Utrecht, as we mentioned in the presentation as well. Students tend to live all over the city. We also advise you to not focus on just some areas, as this does decrease your chance of finding a place. Instead, include all areas and also search in surrounding towns like Zeist, Houten, Nieuwegein, De Bilt, etc. To increase your chances. All these places might not sound familiar to you, of course, but you can find a map of the region of Utrecht on our website that also lists towns and cities surrounding the city of Utrecht, as well as the public transport time from the city of Utrecht to the surrounding towns. So in short, when it comes to bad neighborhoods, no, there are no no-go areas in Utrecht. Let's carry on. Another question about the reserved accommodation program. Someone asks whether it is a criteria for you to be under 27 years old for the reserved accommodation program. And the answer to that is that no, there is only a requirement for the SSH long stay. As we discussed in the presentation, the SSH long stay is different from SSH short stay. So the long stay is not part of the reserved accommodation program. But for the reserved accommodation program, there is no age limit. So you do not have to be under a certain age in order to apply via the reserved accommodation program. Okay. Um, then I see another question about the types of accommodation. So what is the difference between a room and a studio? So typically, a room is a type of accommodation that has a shared kitchen and bathroom facilities, whereas a studio is a type of accommodation where you have your own facilities, so your own kitchen and your own bathroom. So that is the difference between a room and a studio. Um, then another question about rooms. Are the rooms for female only or are they mixed? So the housing complexes are usually mixed gender. You can find more information about this on our website, but typically the housing complexes are mixed gender. Um, Okay, then I see another question about, can you tell me the difference between a roommate and a housemate? A roommate is a person that you would share a room with, and housemates are the people that live in the same house as you. Um, Typically, when it comes to student accommodation, you have housemates and not roommates. Um, okay, let's see if there are some more questions coming into the chat. Um, I see another question again about when does the registration of SSH short stay accommodation start? The registration and booking dates differ per student group. So you can find these dates on our website, uu.nl/housing, after you select your specific student group. Okay. Um, are there any other questions we can get to? Um, Okay, I see some questions about the rent allowance. So as we mentioned in the presentation, the rent allowance is something that you arrange with the Dutch tax office. So I see a question about how do you know if you qualify for rent allowance, whether this is before or after you find a specific apartment or studio. And the answer to that is that the Dutch tax office determines if you meet the individual requirements. So those are the requirements about you and your income, etc. And when it comes to the requirements of a specific studio or accommodation, the landlord can already inform you if that type of accommodation meets the requirements of the Dutch tax office. But again, this is something that you do have to arrange with the Dutch tax office yourself. And as we mentioned in the presentation, um, finding accommodation that does actually meet the eligibility criteria to get the rent allowance is scarcely available. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, then I see another question about the reserved accommodation program, which is whether booking and registration are the same thing. And the answer to that is that no, registration is without commitment and it's free of charge. You need to register before booking starts. Once booking starts, this is on a first come, first served basis. So you can find the registration as well as the booking dates, plus all the instructions for the reserved accommodation program on our website. Something else to keep in mind is that the reserved accommodation is provided by different housing providers, and the registration and booking instructions differ per housing provider. So you can check all of this information on our website. Um, see some more questions about the timeline in terms of starting to search for housing. So, do I need my residence permit to be already approved to begin looking for housing? And our advice to you is to really start looking for housing now as early as possible. Don't postpone your search for housing since it can take a lot of time and effort before you find a house. So our advice would definitely be to start looking for housing now. Okay. Um, Hopefully this does answer a big chunk of the questions that you might have had. As I mentioned as well during the presentation, we do have a more extensive Q&A section on our website, which you can take a look at as well. Perhaps a lot of the questions that you have are already answered in the FAQ section of our website. Okay. Let's see if we have perhaps a couple final questions we answer before we end the session. Um, I see another question about the reserved accommodation program and whether it's possible to book multiple houses when the booking opens. Um, as I mentioned during the presentation, this is not possible, so it's only allowed for you to book one accommodation. If you do book multiple accommodations, then the university will approve only one of them, and which one that is will be random. So make sure that you only book one accommodation. Again, booking is different from registration, so this is specifically about booking. Um, okay. I see some more questions again about when to start looking for housing. So, should I start looking for housing even if I haven't finalized Utrecht as my final college choice? That's a really good question and probably something that maybe many of you here are thinking. Our advice again in this situation is don't postpone your search and at least already start familiarizing yourself with the information on housing, which is available on our website because it can take a long time for you to find housing. So even if you're not completely sure, at least start familiarizing yourself with the information on housing. Okay. Again, some more questions about the reserved accommodation program. Um, if you do make a booking for the reserved accommodation program and you decide not to go, would you have to pay a cancellation fee? Again, as I mentioned, because the reserved accommodation program is provided by multiple housing providers, the cancellation conditions for the different housing providers can be found on our website. Okay. I see a couple more questions in the chat. We will try to answer the final few questions which are in there in these last 2 minutes, and then we will end the session. So again, I see some more questions about the reserved accommodation program. Can I reserve an accommodation with conditional acceptance? The conditions for the reserved accommodation program differ per student group. So go to our website, select your student group for more information about the reserved accommodation program, which is then relevant for your specific student group. If you still have questions about whether you do or do not meet the conditions, you can contact us via email. The email is in the chat as well. Okay. I see a couple more questions in the chat which are being answered in there as we speak. So I think we will end the Q&A here. You will still get an answer to that final question via the chat, don't worry. That brings us to the end of the session for today. Thank you for joining us for the session. We hope you found it useful.